Hello, wonderful people. All right, here we are, getting ready to start on Chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts right off with, like all the chapters, focusing on the strategy. But in this case, I thought the story on McDonald's that was used for as an example was right on the mark. Of course, the chapter is analyzing the firm. And let me just read here from my notes. McDonald's highly decentralized, and I underline decentralized, model gives managers leeway to make their own decisions, which is at the core of their different menu items that the store to include store layouts. And I just have here, etc. Um, Here in Alaska, we think about the McKinley burger. It's probably not a big sale in Florida for McKinley burgers, but you can see somebody brought it up. They ran it up the flagpole with the franchise, and the franchisee got with the franchisor, and just to make sure that it was okay. And I'm sure, as we know, they got permission. But McDonald's allows their managers and their stores to have this type of impact within their communities to make these slight deviations. One of the chapters I was reading with my students in another one of my classes on entrepreneurship was talking about, maybe it was my intro to business, but regardless, talking about in the LA area for the McDonald's, that things that were different were maybe even the texture of the furniture and the colors that would represent cultural identities, or to identify with, whether it be the colors or the textures. And in particular, we're talking about the Asian Americans, which were in large number in this particular community, and how this had a positive influence on their overall numbers, and increasing the production and the number of sales. So that strategy worked quite well. So McDonald's, uh, a lot of people are surprised that they really work hard to provide that type of entrepreneurial type of operation going on in such a large organization. Many would think that they would be more centralized, trying to control everything out of their headquarters, but you can see they do allow a nice degree of decentralization within their organization. Okay, internal analysis. Okay, it says here in my notes, through an internal analysis, a firm discovers many things, to include its strengths and weaknesses, which we touched on in earlier chapters about strengths and weaknesses. And I love how they point this out in the textbook. Strengths suggest possibilities, weaknesses suggest constraints. The text went on to talk about tangible and intangible assets and resources. I'll kind of use those two terms to kind of interrelate with each other. Talked about how tangible and intangible resources are covered um, throughout your text, not just in this chapter. Tangible assets are much easier to evaluate, and of course, your intangible assets and resources can be a little bit more difficult to wrap your arms around. When you put together a balance sheet, I mean, when we're looking at our tangible assets, right? We can look at our plants, we can look at our equipment, we can look at, these physical assets, which land. I mean, the tangibles. It's much easier. Let's say you're doing something like in finance and putting together your financial management and putting together your balance sheet. But now let's start talking about your intangibles. Now, even on your balance sheet, right? An intangible could be something as cool to think about, like goodwill. Lots of your big organizations put a um, perceived value, and of course they need to support that perceived value on the intangibles. Let's see here. What else did they talk about in your text for when it looks about intangibles? Oh, organizational culture could be an intangible. Um, Brand name, and of course reputation. I think reputation kind of goes with the goodwill. Then it talked about resources as options. And then I have here an example, which is right from page 77, at least again my edition of the textbook. Let's see here. What do they have? A company purchases an asset or resource. A piece of land is a good example, which we touched on here a few minutes ago. with the intentions of holding on to the land for future expansion. Resource as an option. This is referred to as a real option because without the land, um, obviously you can't expand in that particular location. Okay, so with I got the sniffles. I think it's all the dust in the air from this recent spring type conditions that we're finally hitting here in Alaska. Actually, it should be summer, but it feels like spring. All right, moving on, away from my sniffles. The true value of a firm's resources, it says here in my notes, emerges when resources are incorporated to form capabilities. Remember from chapter 1 that we talked about core competencies, which are capabilities the firm emphasizes and performs especially well, all in pursuit of the company's vision. In order for core competencies to become a competitive advantage, according to my notes, they must be valuable. We talked about this. Rare and difficult to intimidate, no, to copy, or obviously and non-substitutable. Okay, da, 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 da. Oh, you probably remember, many of you are probably, if you've taken my introduction to business class, you've definitely covered this, but most all of you have covered this in the past from either introduction to business or one of your other classes, the competitive advantage, which was went over here in chapter 4. The chapter talked about competitive advantage being the edge a business has over competing businesses, made up of those things that the business does better than anyone else in the industry. Again, this chapter referred back, and you can see some redundancy going on with some of these terms, but that's okay because the more we have this ingrained into our understanding, the better. Value change, which is the structure of activities the firm uses to implement its business level strategy. Okay, when a firm identifies inefficiencies in how it competes in one or more activities, those activities are candidates for outsourcing. Usually, for some reason, a lot of my students in the past think that's a bad word. No, it's not a bad word. Just as it says here, when a firm identifies inefficiencies in how it competes in one or more activities, those activities are great candidates for outsourcing. It could be your human resources, maybe not all of it, but maybe a lot of the responsibility is outsourced to a company that specializes in it, or maybe specializes in information technology. So it's not a bad thing, as I sometimes seem to hear from some of my students. They just get all up in arms about it. Well, chapter 4 was a good chapter. I really highly recommend that you get a chance that you go through these by chapter to focusing on strategy examples they have, the stories that they have, and the other one that they go through is like in this text they had understanding the strategy, learning from success, which was nicely done, and I believe there was another one. Yeah, how about learning from failure? So these understanding of strategies, in this case, learning from success and failure, and of course the opening at the textbook story where it went over the McDonald's example, focusing on the strategy example. These are great opportunities for you to read the stories and they incorporate the terms that are then later addressed throughout the chapter. So it's a great way of taking it and putting it into a comprehensive format and for you to read about hands-on application and how this how these strategies interact. Okay, that's it for chapter 4. And again, questions, please get a hold of me. And as I'd like to remind you over and over, be proactive versus being reactive, just as you would in most cases. It's hard to be proactive on every thought process, but as much as possible, be proactive, and a strong strategic management is trying to do just that, to be as proactive as possible as the company is moving forward versus always being reactive, as unfortunately too many companies, and of course we learn about their soon-to-be bankruptcies, who rely exclusively on reactive type of mentality. So, students, you be proactive, and I look forward to chatting with you. Again, remember, I gave you my Skype address, and you have my email address, and you have my telephone number, and that's enough. And I look forward to hearing from you. All right, Jim out.